They pushed him, mocked him, humiliated him, but Jalen stood silent, holding back a storm. In a town where one wrong move could brand you forever, he faced a choice: walk away like always, or finally fight back. But when the moment came, what Jalen did left everyone speechless. What happened next? Watch and see. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The bus groaned to a stop in front of Crestwood High, its doors wheezing open as Jalen Carter stepped out into the sharp Missouri air. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, scanning the campus. Red brick buildings, neatly trimmed lawns, and a big bronze eagle mascot statue in the courtyard. It all looked picture perfect, but Jalen knew better. He'd seen enough to recognize the subtle signs. The two quiet whispers when he passed by, the guarded glances students exchanged as they sized him up, and the way teachers' overly rehearsed smiles faltered just for a second when they saw him. It wasn't new. Jalen had moved enough times to know what it meant to be the new kid, but this time felt heavier. His mom had called it an opportunity. His uncle called it a fresh start. Jalen knew what it really was: a test. And the worst part? He hadn't even done anything yet. By second period, the pattern was obvious. Groups formed tight circles he wasn't welcome to break. Hallways quieted slightly when he walked by, as if even idle chatter had to adjust to his presence. His teachers went out of their way to pronounce his name carefully, too carefully, like handling something fragile or unfamiliar. He kept his head down, answered when called on, and ignored the stares that lingered just a beat too long. The air wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was wary, like everyone was waiting for him to prove their quiet assumptions right. When the lunch bell rang, Jalen found himself standing alone in the crowded cafeteria, tray in hand, searching for a seat. The tables were already divided: athletes, honors kids, loud jokers, quiet loners, and him. The whispers weren't even trying to hide anymore. His eyes locked on an empty spot next to a guy buried in his phone. Jalen started walking toward it when he heard it. "You lost?" The words cut through the noise like a knife. He turned to see a blond guy leaning casually, smirking, his friends watching like they were waiting for a show. Jalen exhaled slowly. He wasn't new to this game. Not even close. The guy's name was Brandon Wells, and it didn't take long for Jalen to figure out that Brandon wasn't just some random loudmouth. He was Crestwood's golden boy. Quarterback, student council darling, son of one of the town's wealthiest business owners. And with Brandon came his usual entourage: Mason and Trent, shadows who laughed too hard at Brandon's jokes and nodded at every sly comment. Jalen stayed composed, keeping his answers short. "Didn't realize I needed directions," he said without flinching. Brandon's smirk widened, but Jalen could tell, behind the bravado, Brandon wasn't expecting pushback. "Welcome to Crestwood," Brandon chuckled, but his tone wasn't welcoming. It was the kind of welcome that dared you to survive it. For the next few days, Jalen tried to keep his head down. He wasn't interested in making waves, he just wanted to get through each day without trouble. But trouble wasn't going to leave him alone. The whispers followed him between classes, the stares sharpened, and the comments came louder. "Didn't know they let kids like him in here," someone muttered by the lockers. "Wonder how long he'll last." Another voice said, making sure Jalen heard. He gritted his teeth, but kept walking. He'd survived worse. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. But Brandon wasn't done. It wasn't enough for him to throw side comments. He wanted a show. It started at Jalen's locker when a sudden shove from behind slammed him against the cold metal, the echo rippling down the hallway. "Oops," Brandon said with fake innocence, eyes dancing with amusement. "Didn't see you there." Jalen refused to react. He calmly grabbed his notebook and walked away, but he could feel Brandon's eyes burning into his back. The next time, it happened in the cafeteria. Jalen stepped toward the trash can, only for a foot to shoot out. He stumbled but caught himself, refusing to fall. Laughter followed like clockwork. "Relax, man, it's a joke," Brandon said, smug as ever. Jalen stepped over the foot without a word, leaving them laughing behind him. But Jalen wasn't just walking away to avoid trouble. He was calculating. He knew the game. He knew that sooner or later Brandon would push too far, and when he did, Jalen would be ready. The third time wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. The final bell had already rung when Jalen stepped out of the library, backpack slung lazily over his shoulder. The campus was mostly empty, save for a few stragglers heading to the parking lot. That's when he heard it. Laughter, sharp and deliberate. Brandon and his crew were waiting near the football bleachers like they had planned this all day. "Hey, new guy," Brandon called out, the echo bouncing off the empty lot. Jalen turned just in time for the cold splash of a slushie to collide with his chest. The cup hit him dead center, the ice sliding down his hoodie and soaking into his clothes. Jalen stood frozen for a second, staring at the red stains dripping onto the pavement. Brandon grinned, cocky and careless. Mason chuckled under his breath. "Guess you're not quick enough," Brandon said, stepping forward like he owned the ground beneath his feet. Jalen inhaled slowly, feeling every pair of eyes that lingered from the few students nearby. He could already hear their whispered versions of this story forming. Brandon took another step, shoving him with both hands. It wasn't playful, it wasn't harmless. It was a challenge. For a heartbeat, Jalen considered it, walking away again, swallowing the insult like he always had. But this wasn't just about Brandon anymore. This was about every time he had been told to stay quiet, to be small, to turn the other cheek when someone like Brandon pushed first. Slowly, he set his backpack down, eyes never leaving Brandon. The smirk on Brandon's face faltered just slightly. "Oh, you got something to say now?" he mocked, but his voice didn't carry the same swagger. Jalen didn't answer. He didn't need to. His fists spoke first. A quick feint left Brandon open and Jalen drove a clean right hook into his ribs. The sound cracked in the air and Brandon's breath whooshed out. The next punch came just as fast, an uppercut that sent Brandon sprawling to the pavement, stunned and gasping. Mason and Trent stood frozen, mouths open in disbelief. Jalen adjusted his hoodie, calm, composed, and without a hint of regret. "Anyone else?" he asked quietly. No one dared to move. By the time Jalen walked into school the next morning, it was like the entire campus had flipped overnight. The usual hallway chatter didn't sound the same. It sounded sharper, heavier, laced with whispers that followed him with every step. He didn't have to check his phone to know the fight had spread like wildfire. Eyes tracked him from doorways, lockers, and corners. Some students watched him with wide-eyed admiration, others with cautious distance, like he had become someone to fear. Jalen wasn't sure which was worse. Brandon Tanner was noticeably absent. His loyal shadows, Mason and Trent, lingered by the lockers but kept their eyes glued to the floor when Jalen passed. There were no wisecracks, no smirks, no careless shoves. It wasn't victory, Jalen felt, though. It was something much heavier, a quiet storm beneath the surface. He could feel the way some students looked at him like he was a hero, while others now labeled him exactly what they had always wanted to. A threat. At lunch, it was clearer. Jalen walked into the cafeteria like usual, tray in hand, scanning for a seat. But this time, tables hushed. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Some freshmen nodded nervously like they'd just spotted a celebrity, while others looked away, whispering behind cupped hands. Jalen sat alone, the weight of the entire room pressing against his shoulders. He caught bits and pieces. "Dude's a beast," someone murmured. "Brandon got wrecked." Another voice, lower, more venomous, added, "Typical. Probably won't last a month." Jalen clenched his jaw. No matter how clean the fight had been, no matter how justified, someone would always twist it. It wasn't just about winning or defending himself anymore. He could already see it, the stories being rewritten in real time. The new kid with a chip on his shoulder, the one who went too far, the outsider who proved them right. He ate in silence, pretending not to notice when Brandon's usual crew cleared a path for him without a word. He wasn't seeking approval, and he sure wasn't chasing anyone's fear. But the truth gnawed at him. Had he really changed anything? Or had he just given them what they secretly expected all along? And just when he thought the day couldn't weigh heavier, it did. From the far side of the cafeteria, Coach Simmons watched him. Not like the others. No judgment, no fear, just observation, sharp, calculating. Jalen knew then the coach hadn't just heard the rumors. He was watching, measuring something. But Jalen couldn't tell if that was good or bad. The days that followed blurred together, but one thing stayed constant. Brandon didn't show up. His absence left an odd vacuum, one that shifted the dynamics of the entire school. Without Brandon swaggering through the halls like he owned them, the atmosphere was quieter but no less tense. Jalen noticed how Mason and Trent avoided eye contact, cutting through side halls to avoid crossing his path. Yet the whispers didn't stop. Some students looked at him like a champion, others like a ticking time bomb. Jalen could feel their assumptions wrapping around him tighter with each passing day. It was after gym on Friday when Coach Simmons finally cornered him. "Jalen?" he called out as the locker room emptied. Voice steady but serious. Jalen, half expecting a lecture about the fight, braced himself. Instead, Coach simply nodded toward the back door. "Walk with me." They circled the track in silence for a few moments, the crunch of gravel beneath their shoes filling the gap. "I heard about the parking lot," Simmons finally said, his eyes fixed on the empty field. "Heard you handled yourself." Jalen remained silent, unsure if he was about to be scolded or congratulated. Simmons continued, "But tell me this, did it change anything? Or just give them another reason to label you?" Jalen's throat tightened. He wanted to say it didn't matter, that he didn't care what anyone thought, but deep down, he did. He cared because no matter how hard he tried to stay composed, to be disciplined, the outcome always seemed the same. Judged first, understood second, if at all. Simmons stopped walking and faced him. "You've got skills, kid. Real ones, not just fists. Control, timing, patience. Most guys don't." He crossed his arms. "You ever think about putting that to good use? Wrestling, maybe?" Jalen blinked, caught off guard. Wrestling? He hadn't considered it, not seriously. "I'm not really a team guy," Jalen mumbled, looking away. Coach Simmons smirked. "Doesn't have to be about the team. It's about you. About making sure you're the one deciding who you are, not them." The words lingered. Jalen didn't answer right away. For once, someone wasn't just telling him what he shouldn't do, they were offering him a different way to fight. That night, Jalen sat in his room, the glow of the street lamp outside painting soft amber lines across the faded boxing gloves hanging from his wall. His uncle's gloves. They had always been a reminder of strength, discipline, and patience, values his uncle had drilled into him for years. Jalen ran his fingers along the worn leather, feeling every crease and scar like a story told without words. He thought about what Coach Simmons had said, about choosing who he wanted to be, about not letting people like Brandon define him. But even more, he thought about the weight that had settled on his shoulders after the fight. The looks, the murmurs, the word thug whispered under breaths loud enough to be heard. He had won the fight, but somehow he still felt like he'd lost. The next morning, Jalen found himself lingering by the gym door after class, watching the wrestling team as they moved through drills. It wasn't flashy like boxing, there were no sharp jabs or knockout punches, just raw technique, balance, and control. He could see the struggle, the discipline etched into every movement. He didn't step inside, not yet, but the seed had been planted. Over the next few days, Coach Simmons gave him space but never missed a moment to give him a nod from across the field or a simple, "You think about it yet?" Jalen didn't respond, but he was thinking about it, more than he wanted to admit. The thought gnawed at him during lunch, during walks home, even in his sleep. He had spent so long trying not to be what others thought he was, but he hadn't really asked himself what he wanted to be. On Thursday afternoon, as he passed the gym again, Jalen stopped. For once, he wasn't just walking past. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, the echo of his footsteps filling the space. Coach Simmons looked up from the mats, his face unreadable. Jalen simply said, "Where do I start?" Coach Simmons grinned, not the kind of grin that mocked, but one that welcomed. "Right here," he said, tapping the center of the mat. Jalen stepped forward, unsure but determined. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't just surviving. For the first time, he was choosing. The following weeks were a quiet transformation. Jalen didn't announce to anyone that he'd joined the wrestling team. He didn't need to. His presence on the mat spoke for itself. The practices were grueling, far more disciplined than anything he expected. There were no cheap shots, no crowd to impress, no trophies for knocking someone down. Wrestling demanded more: balance, restraint, strategy. It was a different kind of fight, one that left Jalen drained but focused, sharpened in a way he hadn't felt since his uncle's boxing lessons as a kid. At school, though, things were less quiet. The whispers hadn't stopped, but they had shifted. Some students still side-eyed him, clutching onto their labels. Others watched him differently now, curious, confused, maybe even respectful. Brandon kept his distance, but the tension was still there, lingering in hallways and locker rooms. It was as if everyone was waiting, expecting Jalen to either explode or fade away. Coach Simmons said nothing about it, but Jalen knew he noticed. After practice one evening, as Jalen was packing up, Coach clapped him on the shoulder. "You're getting stronger," he said, "not just out here." Jalen gave a small nod, not trusting his voice to hold steady. Then came Friday. In the middle of lunch, as Jalen was walking past the courtyard, Brandon's voice rang out. "Hey, tough guy!" The courtyard quieted. Jalen turned, spotting Brandon leaning against a bench, with Nick and Kyle flanking him like always. The challenge was obvious, but Jalen didn't move. He could feel the eyes on him, the pressure to respond, to react, to make a scene. But Jalen just stood there, calm and unbothered. Brandon's smirk faltered. "What? Cat got your tongue?" Jalen, with a calmness that surprised even himself, replied, "I've got nothing to prove to you." He turned and walked away, leaving Brandon and his crew blinking in stunned silence. That moment wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The students who had gathered expected a fight. Instead, they saw strength, real strength, the kind that didn't need fists to speak. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Word spread through Ridgemont's halls faster than any rumor, not about the fight, but about Jalen's refusal to fight again. It wasn't weakness they saw this time. It was power under control. Even those who had whispered behind his back, those who had chuckled when Brandon shoved him, were now seeing him through a different lens. Some nodded at him in the halls, some even muttered "respect" under their breath. But not everyone was comfortable with the change. Brandon, for one, wasn't ready to let go. Jalen could see it simmering every time they crossed paths. The stares, the clenched jaw, the way he avoided direct confrontation now but couldn't hide the fact that he was still seething. Jalen didn't need to hear words to know that Brandon wasn't done. But Jalen? Jalen was. Coach Simmons noticed it too. After a particularly tough wrestling practice, he pulled Jalen aside again. "I saw what happened today," Coach said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've been in your shoes. People will call you a lot of things when you don't swing back. Some will call you scared, others will call you weak." He paused, looking Jalen dead in the eye. "But the ones who matter, they'll call you smart." Jalen swallowed the lump rising in his throat. No one had ever called him smart for walking away. Strong? Maybe, but smart? That was new. As the days passed, Jalen started feeling the shift not just from others, but inside himself. He wasn't waking up bracing for another shove or insult. He walked taller, more sure of himself, not because the harassment stopped completely, but because it no longer defined him. Even when he overheard someone call him a thug under their breath, it didn't land the way it used to. It was as if Coach's words had unlocked something, the understanding that strength isn't always about winning the fight in front of you, but knowing which fights are worth it. Jalen wasn't just enduring Ridgemont anymore. He was changing it, quietly, one choice at a time. Jalen's story is more than just a tale about standing up to bullies. It's about redefining what real strength looks like. In a world where people are often pushed to react, where anger is mistaken for power, Jalen chose a different path. He showed us that true power lies not in throwing the hardest punch, but in knowing when to step back and rise above. Like many of us, Jalen faced judgment, whispers, and labels from people who thought they knew him, but instead of letting them define him, he chose to define himself. This story reminds us that we will all encounter situations where our patience, dignity, and self-control will be tested. Whether it's in school, at work, or in everyday life, it's not always about winning the battle. It's about winning the bigger war within ourselves. If Jalen's journey resonated with you, if you've ever faced moments where you had to choose between reaction and restraint, consider liking this video, subscribing for more inspiring stories, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep spreading stories that matter, because sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful.